The following is based on the final accident report published by the National Transportation Safety Board, adopted on May 4, 2010. Some details may be revised as additional information becomes available. On January 15, 2009, at about 3:27 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320-214 with registration N106US experienced an almost complete loss of thrust in both engines after encountering a flock of birds. The airplane was subsequently ditched on the Hudson River, approximately 8.5 miles from LaGuardia Airport in New York City. The flight had been en route to Charlotte Douglas International Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. It had departed LaGuardia about 2 minutes before the bird encounter occurred. There were 150 passengers on board, including 1 lap-held child and 5 crew members. All 155 occupants evacuated the airplane through the forward and overwing exits. 1 flight attendant and 4 passengers sustained serious injuries. The airplane was substantially damaged. The scheduled domestic passenger flight was operating under the provisions of Title 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121, on an instrument flight rules flight plan. Visual meteorological conditions prevailed at the time of the accident. The accident flight was the last flight of a 4-day trip sequence for the flight and cabin crew members. It was also the second flight of the day in the accident airplane. This was the first trip sequence in which the captain and first officer had been paired together. The flight crew flew from Pittsburgh International Airport to Charlotte on a different airplane, and then flew the accident airplane from Charlotte to LaGuardia. The crew reported that the flight from Charlotte to LaGuardia was uneventful. The captain was 57 years old and had been hired by Pacific Southwest Airlines on February 25, 1980. Pacific Southwest Airlines later merged with U.S. Air Group in 1988, which was renamed U.S. Airways Group in 1997. Before his airline career, the captain flew McDonnell Douglas F-4 airplanes for the United States Air Force. He held a single and multi-engine airline transport pilot certificate, issued August 7, 2002, with type ratings in the A320, Boeing 737, McDonnell Douglas DC-9, Learjet, and British Aerospace AVR 146. He held a first-class airman medical certificate dated December 1, 2008, with no limitations. According to U.S. Airways records, the captain had accumulated 19,663 total flight hours. Of those, 8,930 hours were as pilot in command, and 4,765 of those were in A320 airplanes. In the 90 days before the accident, he had flown 155 hours. In the 60 days, 83 hours. In the 30 days, 39 hours. And in the 24 hours before the flight, 5 hours. The captain stated he was in excellent health and was not taking any prescription medications. He had not consumed alcohol in the week and a half before the accident. A search of Federal Aviation Administration records revealed no accident or incident history, no enforcement actions, and no pilot certificate failures. The first officer was 49 years old and was hired by U.S. Airways on April 7, 1986. He held a multi-engine airline transport pilot certificate issued December 31, 2008, with type ratings in the A320, Boeing 737, and Fokker 100. He held a first-class airman medical certificate dated October 7, 2008, with the limitation that he must wear corrective lenses. He was wearing corrective lenses at the time of the accident. The first officer had accumulated 15,643 total flight hours, including 8,977 hours as second in command. He had 37 hours in A320 airplanes, all as second in command. He had received his initial A320 type rating on December 31, 2008. His last line check on the A320 occurred on January 8, 2009, just 1 week before the accident. The first officer stated he was in good health and was not taking any prescription medications. He had not consumed alcohol in the last 10 years. There were 3 flight attendants on board. Flight Attendant A, age 51, was located at the forward jump seat. Flight Attendant B, age 58, was at the aft center aisle jump seat. Flight Attendant C, age 57, was at the forward inboard jump seat. The airplane was manufactured by Airbus and completed by June 15, 1999. It was delivered new to U.S. Airways and placed on its Part 121 operating certificate on August 3, 1999. At the time of the accident, the airplane had accumulated 25,241 total flight hours and 16,299 total cycles. A cycle is one complete takeoff and landing sequence. The airplane departed LaGuardia with a takeoff weight of 151,510 pounds. The maximum limitation takeoff weight was 151,600 pounds. Assuming a fuel burn of 1,500 pounds during the climb and descent, the airplane's weight at the time of ditching was estimated to be about 150,000 pounds. The airplane was configured with 12 first-class passenger seats and 138 economy-class seats. It had 2 cockpit flight crew seats, 2 cockpit observer seats, and 5 retractable flight attendant jump seats. The airplane was equipped with 2 CFM International CFM 56-5B4P dual-rotor turbofan engines. The left engine, serial number 7709828, was manufactured on September 12, 2000, and installed on the airplane on January 15, 2008. At the time of the accident, the left engine had accumulated 19,182 hours and 13,125 cycles since new. The right engine, serial number 7709776, was manufactured on February 16, 2001, and installed on the airplane on May 28, 2006. At the time of the accident, the right engine had accumulated 26,466 hours and 10,340 cycles since new. Weather observations at the time of the accident indicated the following conditions. The 2:51 in the afternoon Central Park surface, weather observation showed winds from 290 degrees at 8 knots. Visibility was 10 miles. The cloud ceiling was 3,700 feet broken. Temperature was -6 degrees Celsius. Dew point was -15 degrees Celsius. Altimeter setting was 30.24 inches of mercury. The water temperature of the Hudson River near the accident location was 5.2 degrees Celsius, or about 41.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The current was ebbing at 1.4 knots, according to the cockpit voice recorder transcript. At 3:24 and 54 seconds in the afternoon, the LaGuardia Air Traffic Control Tower local controller cleared the flight for takeoff from runway 4. At this time, the first officer was the pilot flying, and the captain was the pilot monitoring. At 3:25 and 45 seconds, the local controller instructed the flight crew to contact the New York Terminal Radar Approach Control LaGuardia Departure Controller. The captain contacted the departure controller at 3:25 and 51 seconds, advising that the airplane was at 700 feet and climbing to 5,000 feet. The controller then instructed the flight to climb to and maintain 15,000 feet. At 3:27 and 10.4 seconds, the captain stated, "Birds." 1 second later, the cockpit voice recorder recorded the sound of thumps and thuds, followed by a shuddering sound. According to flight data recorder information, the bird encounter occurred when the airplane was at an altitude of 2,818 feet above ground level and a distance of about 4.5 miles northwest of the approach end of runway 22 at LaGuardia. At 3:27 and 13 seconds, a sound similar to a decrease in engine noise or frequency began on the recording. Flight data recorder information indicated that immediately after the bird encounter, both engines' fan and core speeds started to decelerate. The left engine decelerated from 82 to 35% fan speed. The right engine decelerated from 82 to 15% fan speed. At 3:27 and 14 seconds, the first officer stated, "Uh-oh." The captain followed with, "We got one roll, both of them rolling back." At 3:27 and 18 seconds, the cockpit area microphone recorded the beginning of a rumbling sound. At 3:27 and 19 seconds, the captain stated, "Ignition start." About 2 seconds later, he said, "I'm starting the APU," referring to the auxiliary power unit, which provides an additional source of electrical power. At 3:27 and 23 seconds, the captain took over control of the airplane, stating, "My aircraft." At 3:27 and 28 seconds, the captain instructed the first officer to get the QRH, loss of thrust, on both engines. The quick reference handbook contained the emergency procedures. At 3:27 and 33 seconds, the captain reported the emergency to the departure controller, stating, "Mayday, mayday, mayday." This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds. We've lost thrust in both engines. We're turning back towards LaGuardia. The Mayday portion of the captain's statement was not transmitted to the air traffic controller because another pilot was transmitting on the same frequency at the same time. The departure controller acknowledged and instructed the captain to turn left, heading 220 degrees. At 3:27 and 50 seconds, the first officer began conducting part 1 of the engine dual failure checklist. He stated, "If fuel remaining, engine mode selector, ignition." The captain responded, "Ignition." The first officer continued, "Thrust levers confirm idle." The captain responded, "Idle." About 4 seconds later, the first officer stated, "Airspeed optimum relight, 300 knots." "We don't have that." The captain responded, "We don't." Flight data recorder information indicated that the maximum airspeed reached by the airplane after the bird ingestion was 214 knots. This was below the optimum minimum airspeed of 300 knots for an engine windmill relight. At 3:28 and 5 seconds, the departure controller asked the captain if he wanted to try to land on runway 13 at LaGuardia. The captain responded, "We're unable. We may end up in the Hudson." At 3:28 and 31 seconds, the departure controller offered runway 31. The captain responded, "Unable." At 3:28 and 46 seconds, the controller stated that runway 4 at LaGuardia was available. The captain responded, "I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey, maybe Teterboro." The controller replied, "Okay, yeah. Off your right side is Teterboro Airport." He asked if the captain wanted to try going to Teterboro. The captain replied, "Yes." The airplane had reached its highest altitude of about 3,060 feet at 3:27 and 30 seconds at an airspeed of about 185 knots calibrated airspeed. The altitude then started to decrease. At 3:29 and 11 seconds, the captain announced on the public address system, "This is the captain. Brace for impact." At 3:29 and 14.9 seconds, the ground proximity warning system alert sounded, 1,000. From that point to the end of the recording, the system transmitted a total of 15 alerts, including too low terrain, too low gear, terrain, pull up, and caution terrain. At 3:29 and 21 seconds, the departure controller instructed the captain to turn right 280 degrees and stated that the airplane could land on runway 1 at Teterboro. At the same time, the first officer asked, "Is that all the power you got?" The captain stated to the controller, "We can't do it." He then told the first officer, "Go ahead, try number 1. The departure controller asked which runway at Teterboro the captain wanted. The captain responded, "We're gonna be in the Hudson." At 3:29 and 44 seconds, the first officer stated, "No relight." The captain replied, "Okay, let's go put the flaps out." At 3:29 and 53 seconds, the departure controller stated he had lost radar contact with the airplane. At 3:30 and 1 seconds, the first officer stated, "Got flaps out." At 3:30 and 3 seconds, he reported 250 feet in the air. He continued 170 knots. Got no power on either one. At 3:30 and 16 seconds, he stated 150 knots. At 3:30 and 17 seconds, got flaps too. "You want more?" The captain replied, "No, let's stay at 2. He then asked the first officer, "Got any ideas?" The first officer responded, "Actually not." At 3:30 and 24 seconds, the ground proximity warning system issued a terrain warning followed by pull-up, which repeated to the end of the recording. At 3:30 and 41.1 seconds, the system issued an altitude warning. The captain stated, "We're gonna brace." According to flight data recorder information, the airplane touched down on the Hudson River at 3:30 and 43 seconds. The airspeed at touchdown was 125 knots calibrated airspeed. The pitch angle was 9.5 degrees. The right roll angle was 0.4 degrees. The descent rate was 12.5 feet per second. The flight path angle was minus 3.4 degrees. The angle of attack was between 13 and 14 degrees. The side slip angle was 2.2 degrees. The ditching certification criteria for the A320 assumed a descent rate of 3.5 feet per second, a pitch attitude of 11 degrees, an airspeed of 118 knots, and a glide slope of minus 1 degree. The actual descent rate of 12.5 feet per second was more than 3 times the certification value. The resulting external pressures on the aft fuselage significantly exceeded the values established to demonstrate compliance with the certification criteria. The average external pressure during certification was 7.3 pounds per square inch, actual value was 15.1. The maximum external pressure during certification was 10.9 pounds per square inch. The actual value was 22.6. Within seconds after the ditching, the crew members and passengers initiated evacuation. Based on video analysis, using the time of initial impact as a reference, the following events were documented. At 3:30 and 58 seconds, the left overwing exits were opened, and the first passenger subsequently exited. At 3:31 and 6 seconds, door 1L was opened. At 3:31 and 11 seconds, door 1R was opened. At 3:31 and 16 seconds, the 1R slide raft fully deployed. At 3:31 and 23 seconds, one passenger jumped into the water from door 1L. At 3:31 and 26 seconds, the 1L slide raft began to inflate. At 3:34 and 40 seconds, the first vessel arrived on scene. At 3:54 and 43 seconds, the last vessel departed with the last rescued passengers from the left off-wing slide. Flight attendant A reported no difficulties opening door 1L, however. The slide raft did not inflate automatically. She pulled the manual inflation handle, and the slide raft inflated. Video analysis indicated about 20 seconds elapsed from the time she opened the door until the slide raft began to inflate. Flight attendant C reported that door 1R opened normally, and the slide raft inflated automatically. However, the door started to close during the evacuation, intruding about 12 inches into the doorway and impinging on the slide raft. She assigned a passenger to hold the door open while occupants evacuated. Flight attendant B, after the impact, assessed the conditions outside of door 2L in the aft galley and realized the airplane was in the water. Water was entering the aft area of the airplane rapidly. The aft exits were unusable because of water ingress through the damaged aft fuselage. Flight attendant B and several passengers began redirecting passengers to move forward. The captain and first officer assisted with the evacuation. They noted that many passengers had evacuated without life vests, so they retrieved life vests from under passenger seats and distributed them. After the evacuation, the captain and first officer inspected the cabin to ensure no one remained on board. They then exited onto the 1L slide raft According to the injury chart, there were 0 fatalities. 5 people sustained serious injuries, consisting of 1 cabin crew member and 4 passengers. 95 passengers sustained minor injuries. 55 people, including 2 flight crew and 2 cabin crew, sustained no injuries. The total on board was 155, which included 2 flight crew, 3 cabin crew, and 150 passengers. A serious injury, as defined by federal regulations, is one that requires hospitalization for more than 48 hours starting within 7 days, results in a fracture of any bone other than simple fractures of fingers, toes, or the nose, causes severe hemorrhages or nerve, muscle, or tendon damage, involves any internal organ, or involves second or degree burns or burns, affecting more than 5% of the body surface. Among the seriously injured, 1 passenger sustained a fractured xiphoid process, which is a small extension at the lower part of the sternum. Another passenger suffered hypothermia and was not released from the hospital until about 4:45 in the afternoon on January 17, 2 days after the accident. Flight attendant B sustained a V-shaped, 12-centimeter long, 5-centimeter deep laceration to her lower left leg that required surgery. 2 additional passengers later reported fractured shoulders. 45 passengers and all 5 crew members were transported to hospitals after the accident. Both pilots tested negative for drugs and alcohol. No in-flight or post-accident fire occurred. The airplane was substantially damaged. The right engine was found still attached to the wing. The left engine was found separated from the wing, recovered from the river on January 23, 2009, 8 days after the accident. The horizontal and vertical stabilizers and portions of the movable control surfaces remained attached to the airplane. The nose and main landing gear remained attached and were found in the up-hand locked position. The fuselage sustained damage during the bird strike, the ditching, and recovery efforts. Most of the water impact damage was observed on the aft fuselage, from frame 49 to frame 70. The aft pressure bulkhead damage increased progressively from no damage at frame 47 to subcargo floor crushing from frames 50 to 56, large subpassenger floor deformations to frame 60, partial loss and failure of the lower fuselage skin panels aft of frame 60, and loss of the lower portion of the aft pressure bulkhead at frame 70. The cabin was intact, and no crew or passenger seats were dislodged. The left forward passenger door, door 1L, was found open, undamaged, and in the armed mode. The right forward door, door 1R, was found open and twisted on its hinge. The aft doors were in the armed position. Door 2L was found open, and door 2R was found closed. Examination of both engines revealed extensive damage from the bird ingestion. In both engines, bird remains caused fractures of low-pressure compressor inlet guide vanes, which were subsequently ingested into the engine cores. This caused cascading damage through the low-pressure and high-pressure compressor stages. In the left engine, the high-pressure compressor variable guide vanes were disconnected from their actuator, blocking airflow. In the right engine, the variable guide vanes were entirely destroyed. Foreign material consistent with bird feathers and tissue was found throughout both engines, from the spinners through the low-pressure compressor to the high-pressure compressor. No signs of pre-existing damage or fatigue-type failures were found in either engine. Biological samples were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. DNA testing of 18 samples matched 99% or more to the barcode of life database for Canada goose. Both male and female Canada goose remains were found in the left engine. Only male remains were found in the right engine. Stable hydrogen isotope analysis indicated that the feathers were from migratory geese, significantly different from year-round resident populations in the New York region. Each engine had ingested at least 2 Canada geese, weighing about 8 pounds each. The average weight of a male Canada goose is from 8.4 to 9.2 pounds. The average weight of a female is from 7.3 to 7.8 pounds. The size and number of birds ingested significantly exceeded the engine's bird ingestion certification standards. The airplane was one of 20 A320s in the U.S. Airways Fleet of 75 that was equipped for extended overwater operations. The flight from LaGuardia to Charlotte was not an extended overwater route, so the airplane was not required to carry this equipment for that particular flight. The extended overwater equipment on board included crew member life vests at every jump seat location, passenger life vests at every seat, seat cushions for flotation, 10 infant life vests 2 emergency locator transmitters, 4 slide rafts rated for 44 passengers each, with an overload capacity of 55, 4 survival kits, and 4 lifelines. After the ditching, the 2 aft slide rafts were unusable because of water entry into the aft cabin. Only the 2 forward slide rafts, with a combined capacity to carry 110 people, were available. About 64 occupants were rescued from the forward slide rafts. About 87 occupants were rescued from the wings and off-wing exit slides. Passenger information gathered after the accident showed that 25 passengers, or 17%, reported watching most of the pre-flight safety demonstration. An additional 19 passengers, or 13%, reported watching some of it. Only 12 passengers, or 8%, reported reading the safety information card. Only 5 passengers, or 3%, retrieved life vests from under their seats after impact. The emergency response was swift. The LaGuardia Tower activated the emergency alert notification system at 3:28 and 53 seconds. The airplane was ditched near the New York Waterway Port Imperial Ferry Terminal in Weehawken, New Jersey. Many ferries were operating over established routes in the local waterway. Ferry captains either witnessed the accident or were notified by the director of ferry operations. 7 New York waterway vessels responded to the accident. The first ferry arrived on scene about 3:34, approximately 3.5 minutes after the ditching. The other 6 ferries arrived by about 3:40. 1 Fire Department of New York fire rescue boat arrived on scene at about 3:39. 2 United States Coast Guard small boats arrived at about 3:48. All occupants were rescued within about 20 minutes of the ditching. The responding vessels included the Thomas Jefferson, which dropped passengers at Pier 79 in New York. The Thomas H. Keene dropped passengers at Port Imperial in New Jersey. The Moira Smith dropped passengers at Arthur's Landing in New Jersey. The Yogi Berra and George Washington and Admiral Richard E. Bennies dropped passengers at Port Imperial. The Athena dropped passengers at Pier 79. The Coast Guard assumed incident command and shut down vessel traffic on the Hudson River at about 3:35. The river reopened to non-emergency traffic on a limited basis at about 7:37 that evening. of the 146 passengers contacted after the accident, 91 were dropped off on the New York side of the Hudson River, and 55 were dropped off on the New Jersey side. All 5 crew members were dropped off on the New York side. Flight simulations were conducted at the Airbus Training Center in Toulouse, France, from April 14 through 16, 2009. These simulations were designed to determine whether the airplane could have glided to and landed at LaGuardia or Teterboro after the bird strike. Of 15 valid simulation runs from a point shortly before the loss of engine thrust, pilots attempted immediate turns back to the airports. 8 of the 15 runs, or 53%, resulted in successful landings. However, the immediate turns did not reflect real-world considerations, such as the time needed to recognize the extent of the engine thrust loss and decide on a course of action. One simulation that included a 35-second delay to account for these considerations attempted a return to LaGuardia runway 13, and the landing was not successful. Regarding ditching simulations, 12 valid runs were performed in which pilots attempted to touch down within the certification flight path angle of -0.5 degrees. In 11 of the 12 runs, the touchdown flight path angle ranged between -1.5 and -3.6 degrees. Only one run achieved the target by an Airbus test pilot using a specialized technique. The engine dual failure checklist was originally designed for a dual engine failure occurring above 20,000 feet. Airbus had not considered developing a checklist for use at a low altitude. The checklist was 3 parts and 3 pages long. The flight crew was able to complete most of Part 1, but was unable to start Parts 2 and 3 because of the airplane's low altitude and limited time available. The captain started the auxiliary power unit early in the accident sequence before reaching that step in the checklist. This proved critical because it ensured electrical power was available to the airplane and that the airplane remained in normal law mode, which maintained the flight envelope protections, including protection against a stall. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable cause of this accident. The probable cause was the ingestion of large birds into each engine, which resulted in an almost total loss of thrust in both engines, and the subsequent ditching on the Hudson River, contributing to the fuselage damage and the resulting unavailability of the aft slide rafts were three factors. First, the Federal Aviation Administration's approval of ditching certification without determining whether pilots could attain the ditching parameters without engine thrust. Second, the lack of industry flight crew training and guidance on ditching techniques. Third, the captain's resulting difficulty maintaining his intended airspeed on final approach due to the task saturation resulting from the emergency situation. Contributing to the survivability of the accident were four factors. First, the decision-making of the flight crew members and their crew resource management during the accident sequence. Second, the fortuitous use of an airplane that was equipped for extended overwater flight, including the availability of the forward slide rafts, even though it was not required to be so equipped. Third, the performance of the cabin crew members while expediting the evacuation of the airplane. Fourth, the proximity of the emergency responders to the accident site and their immediate and appropriate response. Among the 44 findings, the investigation concluded that both engines were operating normally until each ingested at least 2 large birds weighing about 8 pounds each. One bird was ingested into each engine core, causing mechanical damage that prevented the engines from providing sufficient thrust to sustain flight. The captain's decision to ditch on the Hudson River rather than attempting to land at an airport provided the highest probability that the accident would be survivable. The professionalism of the flight crew members and their excellent crew resource management contributed to their ability to maintain control of the airplane and fly an approach that increased the survivability of the impact. The flight attendants initiated the evacuation promptly. Although they all encountered difficulties at their exits, they still managed an effective and timely evacuation. The emergency response was timely and efficient because of the proximity of the responders to the accident site. The report resulted in safety recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and the United States Department of Agriculture. These recommendations addressed in-flight engine diagnostics, engine bird ingestion certification testing, emergency and abnormal checklist design, dual engine failure and ditching training, flight envelope limitations awareness, ditching certification requirements, wildlife hazard mitigation, passenger brace positions, slide raft stowage, passenger immersion protection, life vest design, and passenger safety education. The Canada goose population in North America increased from 1.2 million in 1970 to 5.5 million in 2008. The resident goose population increased the most, from 0.2 million in 1970 to 3.9 million in 2008. Wildlife strikes cost the civil aviation industry in the United States about $625 million per year. At least 229 people died, and 194 aircraft were destroyed as a result of wildlife strikes. From 1988 to April 2009, from 1990 to 2008, the FAA National Wildlife Strike Database received 89,734 wildlife strike reports. During the same period, 3,239 turbine-powered civil aircraft sustained damage to a single engine from bird strikes, and 108 sustained damage to 2 engines. About 92% of the strikes occurred below 3,000 feet above ground level. The investigation noted that the success of this ditching mostly resulted from a series of fortunate circumstances. These included that it occurred in good visibility conditions on calm water. It was executed by a very experienced flight crew. The airplane happened to be equipped for extended overwater flight, even though it was not required to be. And the airplane came to rest near vessels that were immediately available to rescue the passengers and crew members. The investigation was conducted by a team from the National Transportation Safety Board. A public hearing was held from June 9 through 11, 2009, in Washington, D.C. Parties to the investigation included the Federal Aviation Administration, U.S. Airways, the U.S. Airline Pilots Association, Airbus, CFM International, the International Association of Machinists, the Association of Flight Attendants, and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. The Bureau d'Enquêtes et d'Analyses, representing France as the state of design and manufacture for the airframe and engines, also participated in the investigation. That concludes the narration of the National Transportation Safety Board's final report on the loss of thrust in both engines and subsequent ditching on the Hudson River involving U.S. Airways Flight 1549.